Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Boss Economics World, the only show bold enough to call out the economic clownery of our so-called leaders while the rest of the world pretends everything's fine. I'm your host, the guy who sees through the smoke and mirrors of government incompetence, here to break down the latest chapter in the tragicomedy of global trade. Buckle up, folks, because today we're diving headfirst into the US-China trade talks, a saga so riddled with economic mismanagement, it's basically a masterclass in how to tank your economy while smiling for the cameras. Let's get into it. The US-China trade talks. The latest episode unfolded on June 9, 2025, in the lavish halls of Lancaster House, London, a venue so posh it practically screams, "We're solving global problems," or at least pretending to. After 6 hours of negotiations, both sides emerged with the kind of vague, feel-good statements that make you wonder if they spent the whole time just complimenting each other's ties. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent called it a good meeting, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick dubbed it fruitful, and President Trump, ever the optimist, proclaimed, "We are doing well with China. China's not easy." Wow, Donald, tell us something we don't know. Meanwhile, China's Vice Premier He Lifeng slipped out the back door without a word, leaving state media to do the talking. A social media account tied to China's Central Television declared Beijing is earnest, but principled. Translation: we'll talk, but don't expect us to budge unless you grovel first. Oh, and in case you missed it, the US is reportedly ready to ease export controls on tech in exchange for China loosening its chokehold on rare earth elements. Because nothing screams mutual trust like a good old-fashioned game of economic chicken. But folks, let's not get distracted by the shiny headlines and diplomatic handshakes. This isn't just about trade talks, it's about the colossal economic mess both governments have created, the recessions they fueled, and the ordinary people left holding the bag. So, grab your popcorn, because it's time to peel back the layers of this economic onion and expose the rot at the core. First, let's talk about the real story here, the US-China trade war, which, despite all the truces and deals, is still very much alive and kicking. Remember when Trump hiked tariffs on Chinese goods back in 2018, claiming it would fix the trade imbalance and bring jobs back to America? Spoiler alert, it didn't. Instead, it triggered a tit-for-tat retaliation from Beijing, tanking global supply chains and jacking up costs for businesses and consumers alike. Fast forward to 2025, and we're still stuck in this quagmire, with trade talks that feel more like a bad reboot of Groundhog Day than a serious attempt at resolution. The data doesn't lie, folks. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, the U.S. trade deficit with China hit $375 billion in 2024, higher than it was in 2017, before the trade war even started. And let's not forget May 2025, when Chinese exports to the U.S. plummeted by the most since the pandemic, while U.S. imports from China dropped nearly 20%. Meanwhile, American farmers, those supposed winners of Trump's trade strategy, are still drowning in unsold soybeans, with the USDA reporting a 15% decline in agricultural exports to China since 2023. But hey, at least the stock market's up, right? The S&P 500 is within 2% of its February 2025 peak, so clearly, everything's fine, if you're a Wall Street fat cat, that is. And China? Oh, they're not exactly thriving either. The International Monetary Fund, IMF, downgraded China's 2025 GDP growth forecast to 4.1%, the slowest pace in decades, thanks in part to the trade war's drag on their export-driven economy. But don't worry, Beijing's got a plan: tighten the screws on rare earth exports, because nothing says we're serious about trade talks like threatening to cut off the world's supply of critical materials for smartphones, fighter jets, and green tech. Brilliant strategy, guys, really sticking it to the global economy. Now, let's zoom in on one of the juiciest parts of this trade drama, rare earth elements. For those of you who've been living under a rock, rare earths are the magical pixie dust of modern technology, used in everything from iPhones to F-35 jets to wind turbines. And guess who controls nearly 70% of the global supply? That's right, China. So, when Beijing starts flexing its muscles and hinting at export restrictions, the rest of the world starts sweating bullets. Here's the kicker, folks, this isn't just about trade, it's about power. China's rare earth dominance isn't an accident, it's the result of decades of government subsidies, lax environmental regulations, and a willingness to play dirty in the global market. According to a 2024 report by the U.S. Geological Survey, China's production costs for rare earths are 30% lower than those of its competitors, thanks to state-backed monopolies and a blatant disregard for pollution controls. Meanwhile, the U.S., which used to be a major player in rare earth mining, has all but abandoned the industry, with domestic production dropping to just 15% of global output by 2024, per the same report. So, what does the US do? Instead of investing in its own rare earth industry or, I don't know, maybe diversifying supply chains, the Trump administration decides to play nice with Beijing, offering to roll back export controls on tech like chip design software and jet engine parts. Kevin Hassett, head of the White House's National Economic Council, even went on CNBC to say, after the handshake in London, any export controls from the US will be eased, and the rare earths will be released in volume. Translation: we're so desperate for rare earths, we'll give China whatever they want, but don't worry, we'll draw the line at Nvidia's super-duper AI chips. Oh, Kevin, you absolute genius, capitulating to economic blackmail while pretending it's a win. Classic government incompetence. Speaking of tech, let's talk about the other side of this deal, the US's export controls on technology. The Trump administration has spent years trying to kneecap China's tech sector, slapping restrictions on everything from semiconductors to AI software. And sure, it's hurt companies like Huawei. Ren Zhengfei, Huawei's founder, even took to the People's Daily to downplay the impact, claiming China can just stack chips to get around the bans. But here's the thing, folks, these restrictions aren't just hurting China, they're boomeranging right back to the US economy. Take the semiconductor industry, for example. According to the Semiconductor Industry Association, US chipmakers lost $1.2 billion in sales to China in 2024 alone due to export controls. And it's not just the tech giants feeling the pain, small businesses that rely on affordable tech imports are getting crushed, too. A 2025 report from the National Association of Manufacturers found that 60% of US manufacturers reported supply chain disruptions due to the trade war, with costs rising by an average of 12%. But hey, at least we're winning the trade war, right? Tell that to the factory workers in Ohio who just got laid off because their company can't afford to keep up with the chaos. And let's not forget the ripple effects on innovation. By cutting off China's access to advanced tech, the US is inadvertently pushing Beijing to become self-sufficient. The Chinese government poured $150 billion into its domestic semiconductor industry between 2020 and 2024, according to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and they're already making strides. Just look at SMIC, China's biggest chipmaker, which released a 7-nanometer chip in 2024, technology that's only a generation behind cutting-edge US chips. So, congratulations, Washington, you've turned a trade war into a tech race, and guess who's catching up? Now, let's zoom out and look at the bigger picture, the global economic recession that both the US and China are pretending doesn't exist. The IMF's latest World Economic Outlook, April 2025, paints a grim picture, projecting global GDP growth of just 2.8% in 2025, the lowest since the 2008 financial crisis. And who do we have to thank for this mess? You guessed it, government mismanagement on both sides of the Pacific. In the US, Trump's obsession with tariffs and trade wars has driven up costs, killed jobs, and spooked investors. The Federal Reserve's own data shows that business investment in the US dropped by 3.5% in 2024, as companies grappled with uncertainty over trade policy. Meanwhile, consumer confidence is at its lowest level since 2020, according to the Conference Board, as Americans face rising prices for everything from electronics to groceries. In China, Xi Jinping's government is no better. Their heavy-handed approach to controlling markets, whether it's rare earth exports or tech innovation, has stifled private sector growth and scared off foreign investment. Foreign direct investment in China fell by 29% in 2024, per the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, as companies fled to less volatile markets like Vietnam and India. But hey, at least the Communist Party's propaganda machine is working overtime to convince everyone that everything's fine. So, what's the real takeaway here, folks? It's not about trade talks or rare earths or tech bans, it's about the utter failure of our so-called leaders to manage the economy responsibly. The US and China aren't just playing a high-stakes game of chess, they're playing with the livelihoods of millions of ordinary people. And while they pat themselves on the back for fruitful meetings in London, the rest of us are left to deal with the fallout, higher prices, lost jobs, and a global economy teetering on the brink of collapse. But hey, don't take my word for it, just look at the data, the headlines, and the empty promises. And the next time you hear Trump or Xi claim they're fixing the economy, remember, these are the same geniuses who got us into this mess in the first place. That's all for today, folks. If you enjoyed this episode of Boss Economics World, smash that like button, subscribe, and share it with everyone you know who's tired of government incompetence wrecking the economy. Until next time, keep your wallets close and your skepticism closer. See ya.